What happens when you give an F-86 Sabre metabolic steroids, stuff it with a Pratt & Whitney, and duct tape nuclear ordnance to the wings? Well, you get everyone's favorite supersonic catfish. That can and will delete an entire grid coordinate with a tactical nuclear weapon. Because why not? Today's video is about the F-100, one of my favorite early Cold War fighter bombers, even with the trouble it had and its notorious issues. So, let's start early in the aircraft's life. In the late 1940s, the United States Air Force was looking to begin development of the successor to the F-86. In 1949, North American Aviation Company did an internal design study, and the first drawings of the F-100 were born. Originally named the Sabre 45 because of its 45-degree wing sweep angle, it was presented as the evolution of the successful F-86. In January of 1951, the company delivered a proposal for a supersonic fighter to the United States Air Force, with a mock-up of the aircraft being completed on July 7th of the same year. It's important to note that they moved real quick with this one, as aircraft development often takes years. For example, the F-15 was in development for around 5 years itself. Now, the mock-up was presented to the United States Air Force and over 100 configuration changes were requested. The aircraft being accepted officially as the F-100, the United States Air Force, in November of 1951. Now, in January of 1952, 2 F-100A prototypes were ordered, and a month later, in February, another 23 F-100s were ordered. And in August, now keep in mind, they haven't even started flight testing yet, they ordered another 250 F-100As. Now, to no one's surprise, development slowed on the F-100 due to the Korean War, the F-86 playing a major part in it. So resources were diverted to improve and ramp up production of the F-86. So again, they moved very quickly with this one, and were trying to get it into service as quick as possible, which unfortunately led to some pretty not great quirks about the airframe. Now, in terms of the timeline for the F-100, we jump to May 25th of 1953. George Welch is conducting the first test flight of the YF-100A, which was actually 7 months ahead of schedule at this point in time. Once he leveled out at 35,000 feet, he accelerated, leaving his chase pilot behind and becoming the first person to ever break Mach 1 in a jet aircraft. Now yes, I know Chuck Yeager was the first person to break the sound barrier, but that was in a test vehicle designed to break it, not a serially produced jet fighter. Now, through testing, many issues were present with the aircraft. It became quickly apparent that while a shorter vertical stabilizer was good for speed, it provided poor longitudinal stability. In addition, the aircraft just had poor stability in general, and the Sabre dance is often referred to during landings. In addition to that, the Pratt & Whitney J57 was notorious for flaming out or compressor stalls, causing a number of crashes. This list could go on and on. There were a lot of issues with the initial production F-100As, which is why there were so many requests made and design changes requested by the United States Air Force. And unfortunately, on Tuesday, October 12th of 1954, George Welch was performing a test flight of the F-100A around Palmdale Air Force Base. He was performing a maximum performance test dive, and during the high G pull-up portion of the test after a dive from 45,000 feet, the aircraft disintegrated. George Welch was able to eject, and was found still in the ejection seat, severely wounded when rescuers eventually got to him. Unfortunately, after being airlifted to the nearest hospital, he was pronounced dead on arrival. The F-100 had not just claimed his life, but was the first of many to lose their lives flying the F-100. In fact, there would be 324 fatalities, just in aircraft accidents alone through the F-100's time in service. Now, as an A&P, I wanted to touch quickly on the actual design of the F-100. Interestingly, the F-100 was the first aircraft to be developed with stabilators. Now, what are stabilators? They are flight control surfaces that combine the horizontal stabilizer and the elevator, basically turning the entire surface into a moving flight control. And on another interesting note, the F-100 also used titanium in quite a few areas throughout the airframe, primarily in the aft portion of the aircraft, due to the high heat the Pratt & Whitney J57 put out. Now, it is very important to remember that this was the 1950s, and this aircraft was designed for supersonic speeds, and while we see modern aircraft breaking the speed of sound in videos and in games quite often, this again is the 1950s. It was heavily limited by the tech available at the time. Now, let's get into the meat of the video. The F-100 entered service with the 479th Fighter Wing of the United States Air Force at George Air Force Base in California. It was officially designated as Operation Ready status in September of 1954. However, due to the aforementioned issues, the fleet was grounded after 6 major accidents and a slew of failures in November of 1954. In February of 1955, the F-100A resumed flying operations. This is also where some of the major design changes began. A larger vertical stab was installed and the total wingspan was increased by 2 feet. Both of these modifications were to assist with stability issues. In addition, the artificial feel system through the ailerons and stabilizer controls were modified to reduce the chance of pilot overcorrection and to provide a better feel of the controls. All currently produced F-100As were eventually retrofitted with these changes and later on were introduced directly into the production line. However, grief for the F-100A didn't end there. As Project Hot Rod being performed in late 1955 come to the conclusion that were made by a lot of pilots during the initial production of the F-100A. It was an ambitious design, but there were a lot of drawbacks with the aircraft. And in total, 203 F-100As were built. And by the beginning of 1958, many F-100As were no longer operational and active duty with the United States Air Force. From then on, they were transferred to the Air National Guard for storage, seemingly ending the story of the F-100A. However, in mid-1959, 15 were transferred to the Republic of China Air Force, which is known today more commonly as Taiwan, so it would be the Taiwanese Air Force. In 1960, another 65 were sent, and yet again, during the Berlin crisis of 1961, many Air National Guard and Air Force Reserve units operating the F-100 were activated, effectively bringing the F-100A back into active duty. At the end of the Berlin crisis in 1962, many F-100As were retained by the United States Air Force and used for training aircrews, though they were considered not being combat capable. And to further extend the life of the F-100A, another 38 were sent to the Taiwanese Air Force, with 118 in total being delivered. In addition, it is also important to take note that the aircraft that were sent to the Taiwanese Air Force were modified with the larger vertical stab and the larger wings, as well as receiving adaptations and upgrades for the AIM-9 itself. In the end, the F-100 was a dangerous aircraft to fly, with an abysmal safety record and around 50 being lost to accidents. The F-100A was finally and officially laid to rest in 1970, bringing an end to the service of the F-100A. Now, there was one interesting modification of the F-100A, and it was the RF-100A. The RF-100A was a creation of Project Slick Chick, where 6 F-100As were modified to carry 5 cameras for reconnaissance. The guns were removed and ammunition bays were emptied to fit the cameras, and a bulge fairing was created to cover the forward fuselage. Pilot training was completed at Edwards Air Force Base and George Air Force Base, initially on the F-100As, then at Palmdale Air Force Base for hands-on training with the actual RF-100As. The RF-100A was in all ways just an F-100A, resulting in pilots requiring additional attention on the aircraft stability and close attention to speed limitations, because the RF-100A was actually fitted with 4 external drop tanks, which made the unstable airframe a bit trickier to fly. Now, once training was complete, 3 aircraft were stationed at Brooklyn Air Force Base in Mobile, Alabama, where they were disassembled, loaded onto aircraft carriers, shipped to Sydenham, Belfast, then reassembled and assigned to Detachment 1 of the 7407th Support Squadron. There, they performed recon missions over Eastern Bloc countries at altitudes at over 50,000 feet. However, only a few missions were performed by these aircraft before the U-2 took over as the primary aerial reconnaissance platform for the United States Air Force. 2 of these RF-100As were lost due to accidents, and the other 4 were eventually transferred back to the US and later supplied to Taiwan. So, a quick note before we touch on the F-100C. The F-100B was never a direct progression of the F-100. What came of was actually the F-107, which never really quite came to be and never progressed past the testing phase. If there is some interest, I wouldn't mind doing a smaller video on the F-107 at some point. Anyways, the F-100C was the North American Aviation Company's answer to the Tactical Air Command call for a nuclear-capable fighter bomber. Initial orders were set in February of 1954, and the F-100C was fitted with additional fuel tanks in the wings, external pylons to carry 6,000 pounds of ordnance, as well as external fuel tanks. It also received upgraded avionics and compatibility with the AIM-9 further on in its production run. In addition, it also received an aerial refuel probe, though I wasn't able to find much information on how often it was used. And of course, being a nuclear-capable fighter bomber, it was capable of carrying the Mark 7, the Mark 28, the Mark 38, and the Mark 43 tactical nuclear weapons. Now, the F-100C did not escape the grounding of the F-100 fleet, and it's the same as the F-100A, it shared many of the initial design flaws. However, it did receive the same changes, and some were even a part of Project Highwire, which involved a heavy electrical rewiring of the aircraft and a whole lot of heavy maintenance. The F-100C also received the J57-P-21, which bumped up performance but didn't really help with the compressor stalls that haunted the J57. The F-100C was never used in combat with the United States, being relegated to a nuclear deterrence role. And while the Turkish Air Force did have a number of F-100Cs, I was unable to find information about which airframes were used in their conflicts. However, the Thunderbirds did use the F-100C for its performances from 1956 to 1964. Now let's talk about what is considered the definitive model of the F-100. The F-100D first took to the skies on January 24, 1956, and over 1,274 of them were made, and they even saw extensive combat. The F-100D was again following in the footsteps of the F-100C, focused on ground attacks with a secondary fighter role, and from the factory, the F-100D received the enlarged wingspan and the larger vertical stab. In addition, the ailerons were moved outward so flaps were able to be installed to assist in takeoff and landings. And there were many upgrades to the F-100D, however, it still had some pretty serious flaws. For example, there were issues with the constant speed drive. The CSD was just to keep the generator of the aircraft at a constant speed so it could continuously supply the proper amount of power at any engine RPM. The system was so unreliable, the United States Air Force actually required it to have its own oiling system. There were also issues with the braking parachutes failing and landing gear failures. And on a more humorous note, at least to me anyways, the refuel probe would snap off during high-G maneuvers. Which is humorous because you could just be pulling a high-G maneuver and suddenly your aerial refuel probe just leaves the chat. In addition, interestingly, in 1958, an F-100D was fitted with an Astrodyne booster rocket and successfully performed a zero-length launch. Though it's quite obvious that idea never really went anywhere. Also, the F-100D was used by the United States Air Force Thunderbirds from 1964 to 1968. And over 700 F-100Ds went through the previously mentioned Project Highwire modification to extend its service life, not only of the airframe, but to also standardize weapons across the fleet. The F-100D was truly the definitive model in the aircraft service life, being deployed not only during Vietnam, but also during the Lebanon crisis and the Second Taiwanese Strait crisis. It was the United States' answer to a predominant ground strike aircraft. However, like the other F-100s, its accident history was abysmal, with over 500 F-100Ds being lost and the predominant reason being accidents. Now, to get to the last variant of the F-100, the F-100F was a two-seat trainer accepted into service in January of 1958. It received many of the weapon system and airframe upgrades as the F-100Ds, though it was primarily used as a training aircraft. Many modifications were also made to the F-100F throughout its service life, with many of the upgrades being the same as the F-100D, and some of the F-100Fs actually did end up going through Project Highwire. Now, on a much cooler note, the F-100F was the first ever Wild Weasel air defense suppression aircraft, being modified with the APR-25 vector radar homing and warning receivers, an IR-133 panoramic receiver with greater detection range, and with a Ka-60 panoramic camera. They were eventually modified to fire the AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missile as well. In addition, they were also used as fast forward air controllers, or as Misty forward air controllers, which was their call sign during participation during the Commando Sabre project during Vietnam, marking targets for more advanced fighter bombers, performing road reconnaissance, and conducting search and rescue missions, and, again, being a part of the top secret Commando Sabre project, which used F-100Fs to fly over North Vietnam and Laos, spotting enemy positions and marking them for airstrikes. During those missions, the aircraft also carried panoramic cameras, and the crew would also have cameras with them and would even take pictures to provide targeting data for future strikes. Now let's talk about what the F-100s did during their time in service. Since we were just talking about it, let's start with Vietnam. On April 16, 1961, 6 F-100s were deployed from the Philippines to Thailand to provide air defense, being the first ever F-100s to enter into a combat zone in Southeast Asia. And from their redeployment date in 1971, F-100 was the longest serving airframe during Vietnam. And as mentioned before, the F-100s had quite a few roles during Vietnam, performing combat air patrols, escorting the F-105 during their missions, performing forward air control duties, Wild Weasel or air defense suppression roles, and performing close air support missions over southern Vietnam. And of course, we can't forget about their participation in the Commando Sabre project. And on August 18th of 1964, the first F-100, which in this case was an F-100D, was shot down by ground fire. And on April 4th of 1965, F-100 escorts providing cover for F-105s engaged in the first jet aircraft air-to-air fight of the war in Vietnam against 4 MiG-17s, with 3 being shot down. However, it is important to note that the MiGs had managed to shoot down 2 of the F-105s, giving a very early warning to the danger that would come from flying bombers and strike aircraft over Vietnam during the conflict. And as the war progressed, the F-100 was replaced by the F-4 Phantom, which I do plan to cover at some point for the combat air patrol missions. It's also important to note that many of the F-100 squadrons in theater throughout the war were activated guard units, or were manned by mostly guardsmen. One example is the Colorado Air National Guard, which flew 24 missions a day, delivering ordnance munitions with a 99.5% reliability rating. And from May 1968 to April 1969, Air National Guard F-100s flew over 39,000 combat hours over more than 24,000 sorties, expending over 4 million 20mm rounds, 30 million pounds of bombs, and over 10 million pounds of napalm. This showed while the F-100 was dangerous to fly, it was lethal in well-trained hands, but by the end of the war, 242 F-100s of various models were lost, and were eventually replaced by the F-4 Phantoms and F-105s. In total, the F-100 logged 360,283 combat sorties during its combat operations in Vietnam, and fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, combat operations came to an end for the F-100 on July 31st of 1971. In the end, while engaging in air-to-air combat during the early days of the war, no F-100 was ever credited with an aerial victory, but in return, no F-100 was lost to enemy aircraft. Though 186 were shot down by ground fire, 7 were destroyed in attacks on air bases by the Viet Cong, and 45 crashed in operational incidents. The F-100 also saw combat in other nations. In fact, the Royal Danish Air Force operated 72, the French Air Force operated 100, the Republic of China, or Taiwanese Air Force, operated 118, and the Turkish Air Force operated 206. The Royal Danish Air Force F-100s never saw combat, and the Taiwanese aircraft never saw combat either, though the RF-100As in service with the Taiwanese Air Force were quite maintenance-heavy, with every flight hour requiring over 100 hours of maintenance. However, the F-100s in service with the French Air Force did perform combat missions in the Algerian War during the 60s. However, I was not able to find much information on the specifics with their involvement or direct combat logs. And lastly, the Turkish Air Force used their F-100s quite a bit, with a major point being their invasion of Cyprus in 1974, providing close air support to Turkish forces around Nicosia and striking targets in the same area. And interestingly, due to previous incursions in Soviet airspace, on August 24, 1976, a Turkish F-100 was shot down by a Soviet SAM battery. A pair of F-100s also penetrated Iraqi airspace in September of 1983, though one aircraft was shot down, but the pilot was later returned and the incident was swept under the rug until it came to light later on. Also, in March of 1987, Turkish F-100s struck PKK bases in northern Iraq. Now, where are you able to fly the F-100? Well, there are a few places you can fly one. War Thunder, which some gameplay has been going on in the background, has the F-100A in the Chinese tech tree, the F-100D in the US and French tech tree, and the F-100F in the Chinese tech tree as well. It is also playable in Metal Storm, though I've personally never played that game and can't give you much information on it. There are also community mods in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and a highly realistic and true-to-form F-100D from the Vietnam era currently being worked on as a module for DCS. So, why do I like the F-100? Well, to me it's an interesting point in what I like to consider the Wild West period of jet aviation. It was that point in time where if you could make it fly, there was always going to be some kind of degree of interest, even if it was never produced. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand it was a dangerous aircraft to fly, with 324 pilot deaths and 889 aircraft lost just to accidents, with an additional 242 lost in Vietnam. In total, around 1,131 aircraft in total were lost out of the 2,294 produced, resulting in an attrition rate of around 49% of the total produced aircraft. It was truly a dangerous aircraft, but showed during Vietnam it could be used effectively. And it started the idea of supersonic fighter aircraft, and through its many accidents, gave designers important lessons that formed the basis for all of our favorite aircraft. It was truly a pivotal moment in American aircraft design, with the lessons being learned applied even today. Becoming the first serially produced supersonic jet aircraft isn't something to scoff at. And again, it's important to remember that this was an age where supersonic was just an idea. Yes, it served later on when F-4 Phantom and the F-105 became widely available, but when it was first drawn up in the 50s, there was nothing else like it. So, for all of its flaws and the blood it drew, it sits on a pedestal for me as the start of an era in aviation, where looking cool and going fast really became an art form. But thank you all for watching. I hope you learned a few things during the video, and I hope you enjoyed it. The style of these videos will probably change as I learn what works and what doesn't, so if you have any suggestions or constructive criticism, please leave a comment and let me know. Also, let me know if I got something wrong. The best knowledge is a collective one, and I'm happy to learn more. And if you would like to see more of these videos in the future, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with when and what I post, as well as community updates, as I will be using that to update people on the status of the videos as they progress through production phases. And keep an eye out for the gameplay video on the F-100, as that will be coming out next. And if you guys would like to see something covered, please leave a suggestion for me for what I should check out next. Otherwise, I will see you guys next time. I hope you all have a good day, night, evening, wherever you are in this world. I hope you have clear skies and easy flying.